Okay, I think we're just waiting for the last people to come back and join us. So welcome this evening if you're in Europe, and sometime earlier in the day if you're somewhere else in North America. And if you're in Australia, you're probably asleep. But this is the 19th century, and anyone who's working on the 19th century should be here. So I'm really pleased to welcome you all back, and we've got another wonderful panel starting now, and I'm going to quickly introduce everyone so to make sure there's enough time for conversation. So we've got three speakers again. The first speaker is Giuseppe Grieco from the University of London. He's a fellow at the Luigi Einaudi Foundation in Turin, and he's just waiting to his viva for his PhD at Queen Mary University on the British Empire and the two Sicilies, constitutions and international in a revolutionary Mediterranean. His research interests lie at the intersection between intellectual, imperial and global history, and focus in particular on British Empire, international law and the transnational circulation of political ideas in the 19th century Mediterranean. And he has publications that include a working paper on law and empire in the central Mediterranean, reimagining the international system from the margins. Then our second speaker will be Ciaran McDonnell, who is a military historian specializing in identity, war and society. His PhD is from Maynooth University, and it looks at Irish identity in the British military during the French Revolutionary Wars. And his postdoctoral research at the Institute for Historical Research explored Jacobinism and the Irish Brigade in the French Army. His recent publications include From Vinegar Hill to Knightstown Bog, Forging Identity in the Irish Militia and the Catholic Irish Brigade in the British Service. And finally, the third speaker will be Stephen Press from Stanford University, speaking on European states and the case of neutral Mresnet, 1815 to 1853. I can't wait to find out about neutral Mresnet. Stephen is assistant professor at Stanford. His first book, Rogue Empires, which was about Europe's scramble for Africa, received the AHA's Pacific Coast Branch Book Award. And his second book, Blood and Diamonds, Germany's Imperial Ambitions in Africa, appeared last year. And he has other projects, including on America's lease of Guantanamo Bay and post-Napoleonic European nationalism, which is in an article in Central European University histories. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, Giuseppe Grieco, who's speaking on imperial security in the central Mediterranean, Britain, the two Sicilies, and the Congress system after 1815. So we're going to hear from three speakers, then we'll have Q&A at the end. Thank you so much, Giuseppe. Take it away.
Thank you for this very kind introduction, and many thanks to the committee for organizing this wonderful conference. So I'll start by sharing my screen with the presentation. Okay. Hopefully it's working and you should be able to see it. So the topic of my presentation today is the British imperial presence in central Mediterranean after the Congress of Vienna. And I'll try to highlight and show you what the consequences of that presence, especially in the two Sicilies and the surrounding maritime area were. I'll call this an area at the margins of a region at the margins of the international system. And I'll explain you in a bit what I mean by region at the margin. That was an area in between Naples, Sicily, the Ionian Islands, and Malta, where Britain consolidated its imperial presence and promoted projects of legal reordering during the Napoleonic Wars. At that time, Britain occupied Sicily for a short time, and then established a permanent presence in the Ionian Islands and in Malta throughout the mid-19th century. In that area, Britain in particular established an asymmetrical yet symbiotic alliance with the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies that persisted after 1815. It was an asymmetrical alliance because of British hegemony in that area, British imperial power, but also a symbiotic because it lent legitimacy and protected the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the international realm. So that was a region at the margin because it was in between the European state system and the colonial world. It was a region at the boundaries of the international system between civilization and semi-civilization, between the rule of sovereignty and non-intervention, which applied to European space, and the imperial expansion in the extra-European world. In that region, intellectual exchanges between British and Southern actors promoted a sort of laboratory of word-making practices, where new imaginaries of the international, of empire, were shaped at that time. And in particular, today, I'll be focusing on the conceptions of international system and security that were established at that time in that region. And in particular, I show that that region, that specific area at the margins, can offer a different viewpoint, a different perspective on the invention of the international system in the 19th century. That moment was characterized by the establishment of unequal legal regimes, civilizational ordering, and hierarchies between Europe and the rest of the world. But in that area, the double standards and semi-peripherality applied also to states that participated within the European system, within the European concept, such as the a Southern European and Christian Catholic state as the Two Sicilies. So after the 1815, that region was a sort of laboratory for new ideas and practices for securing and reforming the European concept. In particular, that area shows that the imperialist and exclusionary nature of the post-Napoleonic order applied to Southern European states at the periphery of Europe. So European great powers and imperial powers not only projected their imperial competition and cooperation toward extra-European powers such as the Ottoman Empire, but also within the European space, at the margin of that space. And in that area of, and that imperial site where Britain consolidated its presence, hierarchies and double legal standards toward the Two Sicilies were established. In particular, that perspective of a different view, a more nuanced view on the so-called insulation of the European system in the 19th century from imperial, commercial competition in peripheral and overseas territories. And in particular, it helps overcoming the idea of a rigid dualism between Europe's public law, the European system, and the wider world. So in this space, which was part of the European security system, at the same time, that space was also involved as a paracolonial space or quasi-sovereign space within the British imperial orbit, where Britain and its agents complemented and exported the security system, the Congress system, to the borders of Europe in the Mediterranean. So in this region, Britain consolidated a security system that was part of a larger oceanic legal framework. And in particular, peace, order, and anti-revolutionary security were needed by Britain in the Mediterranean to protect strategic sea lanes toward the Indian Ocean, where it had consolidated its power and its presence during the Napoleonic Wars. So in this region, Britain promoted a security strategy parallel to that of the Holy Alliance, parallel that the Congress system, to support moderate reforms, prevent democratic and republican ideas and revolutions, but also foreign intervention to protect its imperial hegemony in that area. And the two main actors that promoted this strategy were William McCurt, the ministry plenipotentiary in Naples, and Thomas Maitland, the Lord High Commissioner of the Ionian Islands, a governor of Malta. The strategy of these two men who established a close cooperation and intelligence networks and exchange of knowledge between Naples, Palermo, the Ionian Islands, and Malta, mainly aimed at fostering and promoting proconsular administration, what Christopher Bailey called proconsular despotism, not just in British colonial possessions, but also in Naples and Sicily, where they fostered the unity and the centralized development of the dual Sicilian state. And they exported a Napoleonic style administration, both to the Ionian Islands and Malta, but also in the two Sicilies, where they were, in particular, William McCurt helped the Bourbon administration in consolidating a centralized bureaucracy and an hierarchical mode of administration. This was not the only, and I just like to show you a quote from Maitland suggesting to occur that constitutions were not the most useful way to export stability and security in that area of the Mediterranean, after some experiments in constitution making had failed in Sicily, but also in other regions of the Mediterranean during the Napoleonic Wars. So they were a sort of, they exported a sort of conservative pragmatism. They were mainly interested in strengthening the power of government and administration. And of course, they had lost any interest in constitution making if compared to previous agents that were deployed in that area during the Napoleonic Wars. So centralized administration was the first part of their strategy. The second part was to help the restoration of the power of the Bourbon king as a grateful ally to Britain, as someone who wished to preserve a close connection with the British Empire, and to balance at the same time the power of Austria in that part of the Italian peninsula. And in particular, Kirk was the main actor who helped the Bourbon king in achieving the withdrawal of Austrian troops from Naples in 1817. And as part of this consolidation of Bourbon power and protection from other great powers, William McCurt and Maitland also fostered commercial ties between Naples and the Ionian Islands and offered security and tutelage from the Barbary pirates. And they used that as a leverage to negotiate a very favorable commercial treaty with the two Sicilies that completely destroyed Neapolitan shipping and manufacturing takeoff at that time. So to increase the British authority and British power over a weaker state. But most of all, they established in that area a non-intervention area to cut off the influence and the penetration of other imperial competitors. And most of all, they aimed at cutting off and limiting Russian presence in that area. In particular, Russia at that time was establishing intelligence and communication networks between the Ionian Islands and the Apulian ports in the two Sicilies, where Russian officers were employing Neapolitan subjects, Ionian and Greek patriots to promote and to endorse Greek patriotism, Ionian patriotism within the Russian orbit. And of course, British agents were very scared about this presence, and they aimed at limiting that penetration, and they deployed their officers and their agents in Naples, in Apulia, and in the Ionian Islands to check these Russian networks in this area through their own intelligence networks. But what happens in 1820 with liberal revolutions in Naples, Sicily, and then in 1821 in the Ionian Islands is that liberal revolution disrupts this British system of security. They disrupt this system because they create territorial and legal crisis. In particular, the most crisis occurred in Sicily, because Sicily declared its, especially the city of Palermo, declared its own independence from Naples, and tried to convince, you see in the picture on the right, the British consul to offer British protection and to restore a British protectorate in Sicily against the Bourbon power. And of course, this situation completely embarrassed the British government and embarrassed a coup. But at the same time, other territorial crises emerged in the Ionian Islands, where other minor islands such as Zante and Cephalonia attempted to secede from Corfu, where the main central power was held by Thomas Maitland. So these territorial crises threatened centralized administrative system that British agents had contributed to establish after 1815. And so at this time, William McCurr, who was totally aware that the Sicilian crisis involved Britain because of the past legal engagements between Britain and Sicily, of the past constitution making that Britain had promoted in Sicily during the Napoleonic Wars, he attempted to deploy a sort of moderate reformism, like many other commissioners, colonial commissioners at that time in other parts of the British Empire, a moderate reformism that mainly aimed at halting democratic revolutions and disorder, and avoiding revolutionary contagion to the other parts of the British Empire in that region, so Malta and the Ionian Islands, and favor a moderate constitutionalism. So that's why he also distanced himself and British agents who work with him from the proceedings of the other European great powers, and started promoting a policy that went beyond traditional British strict non-intervention, and started endorsing projects in Naples aimed at halting the Austrian intervention, which was decided at the Congress of Troppau and Laibach, and of course occurred in 1821, and mainly aimed at blocking the Austrian intervention, because he knew that Russia could exploit that counter-revolutionary intervention to start endorsing oppressed nationalities in the Mediterranean, and in particular moving troops to Greece, where he could promote another intervention after that the Russian intervention in Naples had been justified by the other European powers. And Maitland worked with William McCurr to block this revolutionary and at the same time counter-revolutionary plans in the region. And they both agreed to send the British fleet to patrol the major cities, to police the major cities and ports of the coast, to check the passage of Austrian troops when intervention in the end was decided, and to try to promote in the two Sicilies and to consolidate that in Ionian Islands too, a sort of what they called a shadow of a constitution. So a moderate constitutionalism that could stabilize these territories like Naples and Sicily, and preserve these territories within the British sphere of influence. Of course, this happened just in a limited way because of the Bourbon king opposition to this measure, and the Bourbon king decision to fully endorse the intervention and the restoration of his absolute power over the two Sicilies. And I decided to show you this satirical image, Spanish satirical image that depicts the Bourbon king as a chef cooking macaroni for the great powers, since it testified the subordinate and subservient status of the two Sicilies that was reinforced by the decision of the great powers to intervene in that region. But that subordinate status and that sort of double standards that apply toward the two Sicilies in the European concert was reinforced also by the fact that the Bourbon king repeatedly refused to endorse British proposals for reforms, for the concession of constitution throughout the 1820s and early 30s. So the Bourbon failure to deliver capacity for sovereignty and state building and order that was asked by the British agents and by the British diplomats in that area led to the gradual transformation of that British semi-protectorate over the two Sicilies into an instrument for promoting civilizational ordering and pushing the two Sicilies at the margins of the European system, at the margin of what they call the West, or at the margins of humanity. So at that time, and especially since the late 1820s, and throughout the 30s and 40s and 50s, the British Empire started endorsing a more assertive civilizational and jurisdictional projection over the two Sicilies through free trade, discourses about humanity and civilization and humanitarian intervention to put the two Sicilies at the margin of that sphere and to promote in a more assertive way British imperial interests. That occurred in the 1840s, when Britain promoted intervention to curb a sulfur monopoly that had been established by the Bourbon king against free trade in Sicily, to impose duties on the export of sulfur. That was a critical material for British industries. But that also occurred in the 1848, when during a civil war between Naples and Sicily, while the Bourbon troops were attempting to reconquer Sicily, Britain intervened through a humanitarian intervention to impose a ceasefire and block the Napoleon reconquest of Sicily. And that expulsion of Naples from the European order definitely occurred with the Congress of 1856. After that, Naples had sort of allied itself with Russia during the Crimean War. It had remained neutral but favored Russian ambitions. And due to that fact, the British Empire decided to attempt to establish at the Congress and then to proclaim after 1856 the expulsion of the two Sicilies from the civilized nation, from the family of the civilized nations. And to conclude, I just say that Neapolitan and Sicilian patriots who were totally aware of the status of their nation, the expulsion of their nation from civilization and humanity, and the fact that international law was used to project European sovereignty and imperial jurisdiction over the two Sicilies, started shaping international law as an emancipatory project, as a project that could assert the rights of their nation and establish international law upon the principle of nationality. The only way they believed they could claim their own independence was to transform international law from a European into a global and cosmopolitan instrument, so that the European status of the two Sicilies could no longer be questioned, and to establish national self-determination as a universal rights of all nations. So not just of the European nation. The British agents and British thinkers accepted that principle in 1860 when they justified the Italian unification, but they limited that principle to European states. So they transformed that into a principle for consolidating the boundaries of civilization in the Mediterranean, and expel extra-European subjects and nations and societies from that European order. So overall, I think this viewpoint, this central Mediterranean viewpoint, could be useful to shed lights on hidden spaces of empires within Europe itself, and to expand current conceptions and imaginaries of the international beyond hierarchical and colonial double standards and hierarchies. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Giuseppe. The questions are coming in thick and fast. So, and I've got lots too. But next up is Ciaran McDonnell, who's going to speak who's speaking on guarding Ireland, guarding empire. Thank you, Ciaran.
Thank you very much, Glenda, and thank you everyone for coming along this evening. So I'll just make sure I'm sharing my screen. Just there we are. Okay, so I wanted to talk today about Ireland's position within the British Empire, which has an interesting position because as it is considered often both a colony and a part of the British Empire. And the Irish people were both colonized and colonizers. And in particular, I'm going to look today at the example of how built infrastructure, military infrastructure, was used by the British to exert control in Ireland and to allow it to take part in a wider imperial project. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the support of a number of organizations for this research, namely Clare County Council, the Heritage Council of Ireland and their Adopt a Monument programme, and Abarta Heritage. They all supported my research, which was done on behalf of the Labashida Projects Group, which is a local community group down in West Clare in Ireland, which has started to restore and bring back to life this coastal battery that I'm going to be looking at. I'd also like to thank Labashida ICA Group and of course Martin Fitzpatrick, the owner of the landowner as well. So I'm just going to give a brief historical context for the invasion threat in the 18th century in Ireland and why coastal defences were required. I'm going to look specifically at the Kilkerran Battery and the other Shannon forts, and then look at the peace, in inverted commas here, of the peace lifetime of the battery. And this is because while it was built during the Napoleonic Wars, it was only completed around the time of Waterloo. So it sort of missed the wars, but yet it continued to be in use for the decades to come, right up until the end of the 19th century. And that's what I want to look at today. So just as a bit of context, I'll be discussing the batteries that were built on the lower Shannon. The Shannon is the longest river in Ireland, or actually Britain for that matter. And it is therefore, you can see here on this map that it runs up the middle of Ireland and occupies a very strategic position. The lower Shannon, the estuary leading up to the port city of Limerick, is therefore very important. And you can see here from this insert that the gun battery I'm looking at was situated at Kilkerran Point, which was right in the middle of the Shannon estuary, and therefore a very strategic, very important point for guarding the approaches to Limerick and its commercial port. So this is the battery as it looks today. It's being restored, as I said. So I believe a lot of that overgrown vegetation has been removed since I was last down there. But you can see here it's right on the coast and has a very good view of the Shannon estuary. So just to give the context of why these batteries were built in the Shannon and elsewhere in Ireland. In December 1796, almost 15,000 French soldiers came very close to landing at Bantry Bay in West Cork. They had been brought to Ireland to help in the rebellion of the United Irishmen by Theobald Wolfetone. And it was only the bad weather, the storms, the December storms that stopped the invasion fleet from landing. 2 years later, when the United Irishmen finally rose in rebellion, a smaller force of roughly 4,000 to 5,000 Frenchmen were sent to the west of Ireland, where they landed in Mayo, and they succeeded in routing the first government force of British soldiers, British and Irish soldiers that were sent to attack them, although they were eventually defeated. But this is just, the invasion threat in Ireland was very, very real. And this was why they need the coastal defences needed to be built. The Act of Union came about in the wake of the war of the 1798 rebellion, and this united the parliaments of Britain and Ireland became part of the United Kingdom proper. As a result, the Irish Board of Ordnance, responsible for all coastal defences, was dissolved, and it was amalgamated into the British Board of Ordnance. And this was operated by the Royal Engineers. Of course, they built in England, over 100 Martello towers were built to defend the coast during the Napoleonic Wars, and around 50 were built in Ireland, such as this one at Killiney in Dublin. 81 signal towers were also built to watch for further French invasion attempts. And as you can see from this map here by Bill Clements, it really was a very extensive network running from Dublin right around the coast up to Donegal. A French perspective was offered by General Charles Francois Dumouriez, who was a French royalist turned Republican who had then fled the revolution to Britain and had offered his services. Even he recognized the importance of the Shannon Estuary in a report on the defenses of Britain and Ireland, and he recommended batteries to be placed at these various points, including the interpoint of Kilofin. So that's where our battery is, at Kilkerran. And he said that if we save Ireland, we save England. And if it is invaded and revolutionized, the British Empire is lost. So even Dumouriez, the famous French general, is worried at this point about the British Empire and recognizes the importance of Ireland within the British context. The batteries were built, plans were drafted in 1809. As you can see here, some beautiful drawings from the National Archives in Kew. The following year, the Board of Ordnance approved the plans for 6 batteries on the Lower Shannon, £26,000 in the old money, which roughly equates to 1.23 million in today's money. Land was purchased from the local landlord, and the tenant farmers who worked the land were given compensation. The forts were, as I said, completed only in 1814 to 1815, when the invasion threat had passed. So one could argue they were a waste of time and money, yet they are continued to be used in the post-Waterloo period. And as you can see here, these are the positions of the batteries that were built, the 7 batteries, all guarding the approaches to Limerick and its vital port. This is a sketch of the battery as it would have looked, and it would have been armed with 6 24-pounder cannons. As you can see here, an aerial view. And this was the view across to the other side of the river. And the guns at the battery could actually reach that side of the river. So it really was a very strategic location. It also had 2 howitzers positioned on the roof of the guardhouse. And these were designed to fire on the landward side, not only to attack a potential French landing force, but also to attack potential insurgents coming from within Ireland itself. So as I said, even in peacetime, as you can see here, in the days after Waterloo, one of the British generals in Ireland is recommending that 500 men are still to be garrisoned in these batteries, while another 1,000 will be sent to Limerick. So a substantial investment in the both internal and external security of Ireland in the wake of Waterloo. There also, in the decades that followed, I came across this interesting example of a local threat to food security, where it's the case of the gunners at the battery, Harris and Willett. And they came to the attention of the Lord Lieutenant when 6 locals wrote to him in 1833, complaining that the Harris and Willett had blocked access from them to the seaweed on the foreshore at the battery that they had required to manure their crops so they could grow their potatoes. And they were demanding potatoes and whiskey as payment to allow them access. They claimed that Harris had robbed them of their only resources they had to yield their potatoes, and described their half-starving families. They claimed they were the most aggrieved, the most persecuted, and most oppressed creatures on the face of the earth, subject to military depredation. This interaction with the locals was very much not desirable for the military authorities in Ireland, and the Board of Ordnance sternly replied that directions had been given that the collection of seaweed should not be interfered with. So, as I said, Ireland occupies this interesting, though not unique, we need to avoid Irish exceptionalism ideas here. Ireland has an interesting position where troops were needed to garrison Ireland to maintain its security, but Ireland was still a very fertile recruiting ground for the British Army. Roughly 1/3 of the British Army and 1/3 of the British Navy was Irish at this time. So Ireland could be used as a position, as a base for regiments, both Irish and British regiments, before they were deployed overseas to the various parts of the wider empire. It can be considered a divided island, even after the Act of Union, with various security concerns. The most obvious example is the political divides between loyalists who clung to the British Crown and British authority, and Republicans and evolving into nationalists who sought to separate themselves from British rule. These were often parallel with, but not always, coterminous with the Protestant and Catholic divide. A small Protestant minority ruled over a Catholic majority in Ireland, and Catholics had only recently been allowed to stand for election in 1829. In the 1800s, you also saw the Ribbon Men movement, a secret society that was formed to protect the Catholic interest in Ireland by attacking Protestant landlords or Protestant farmers. The Tithe War in the 1830s was another underground movement, an underground war to resist payments to the Protestant church, the established church in Ireland. And as you can see, in 1835, orders were given that most coastal defences were to be dismantled because of the cost it was to maintain them. But the shipping ports at Dublin, Lough Cork, and the Shannon were to be retained, showing the importance of maintaining this maritime security, this coastal security in Ireland, and its importance as part of the wider trade of the empire. The repeal movement from the 1830s into the 1840s sought to repeal the Act of Union. This was led by the famed Irish politician Daniel O'Connell. In the wake of this movement, this movement was greatly weakened during the famine, the Irish famine, where 1 million Irish people died of starvation and another million emigrated. Towards the middle of the famine, you had the Young Irelanders Rebellion, part of the wider year of revolutions in 1848. This amounted to very little. It was an abortive rising and was quickly defeated. And then by the time the Crimean War comes around, the Board of in the wake of their poor performance and during the war, the Board of Ordnance who had constructed the forts is dissolved, and their duties are taken on by the War Office. So just to go into a little bit more detail into the repeal movement and the internal security challenges that this brought about for the British authorities in Ireland. On the 16th of June, 1843, the Freeman's Journal reported on the de Grey folly. De Grey was the Lord Lieutenant in Ireland, the King's representative in Ireland. And they described how 2 steamers had been sent to be stationed between Limerick and the entrance to the Shannon. So deploying the Navy to help overawe the local population and provide a threat of force in case of, to help deter people from supporting the repeal movement. It also reported how the police had been given extra ammunition. And this is important to note because unlike in Britain, the Irish police force, the Royal Irish Constabulary, was an armed police force. It was a militarized police force. It described how the forts on the lower Shannon, including Kilkerran, were to be garrisoned by the Royal Marines. And I'll speak more on that shortly. It also described how the government planned to apprehend O'Connell and have him tried for high treason. And that was why the government was flooding the country with troops. So Ireland was becoming, even after 1798 and the defeat of the United Irishmen, Ireland was still a country simmering with tensions and becoming more and more militarized. On that same day, the Irish Examiner reported warlike demonstrations. It described how soldiers were, when attending church services, were fully armed with guns and ammunition. So clearly another indicator of the heightened tensions in Ireland. It also reported on the communications between the officers of the local districts and those in command of the batteries on the Shannon. It also later in the article reported how detachments of troops were being sent to nearby Listowel in County Kerry to attend the repeal meetings. So you can imagine the tensions that this would only increase the potential for increasing the tensions. And again, I thought it was just important this should be taken into the context of the Chartist movement and the Anti-Corn League in Britain as well. So it wasn't just that Ireland was becoming unstable. There were threats to internal security within Britain as well. So just to briefly talk about the Royal Marines, as you can see from this chart here, were deployed to the Shannon forts. They were based at Tarbet, which you can see is one of the locations located here, 100 Royal Marines and 100 sailors. And I'm drawing on the excellent work of Jerome Devitt here, who has worked extensively on the navalization of Irish waters and how the Royal Navy was used by the British government to encourage the loyal and overawe the disaffected. That's a quote from one of the letters of the Admiralty officers. Even after the period that we're looking at for the conference this evening, I just wanted to briefly mention the fact that even in 1870, the commercial importance of the ports of the Shannon batteries is recognized. This defense report from the principal ports and anchorages of the United Kingdom reported that the importance of the trading interests of the country, and therefore it recommended that Kilkerran Point and others would be upgunned. Their guns would be replaced by more modern artillery. And briefly just wanted to show here again, in the later years, as the invasion threat receded, a variety of troops were rotated through the forts on the Shannon. The Royal Artillery, the East Devonshire Regiment, the Coast Brigade, the local Clare Militia, but they still had time for regattas, while also replacing their guns again, more regattas, and organizing and selling fishing rights for the area. The Admiralty were selling these. And it was only in the 1890s that the forts were finally vacated. Even after they were vacated, they still retained some security potential. This is a map that was drawn in 1869, but this is actually a 1900s copy. And as you can see, they have censored the gun battery position. So you can only see the non-military structures. This is what it should look like. This is an unedited map from an earlier period, which shows what guns were positioned there. So just to conclude, as you can see from the map here, Martello towers were built all over the empire, not just in Ireland, not just in Britain, to protect imperial interests. In Ireland, they also roads were built through the Wicklow Mountains as a way of bringing imperial power, British power, into areas that were usually rebel strongholds. Police barracks like this one in Carsiveen were built later in the 1830s and 1840s. And as you can see, they were highly defensive. Forts, barracks, like this Fort George in Inverness in Britain or in Scotland, or barracks in Ireland or barracks overseas were reused. So this Fort George, for example, dates from the 18th century. And also, as our earlier speaker has mentioned, coastal forts were built in new locations, such as in Malta, to help protect imperial interests. So as you can see, the Shannon Estuary has a very important position in Irish history and also in British imperial development as well. The coastal defences of Ireland, Britain and Empire secured not only the home ports, but also provided the ability to project imperial power overseas. Troops would embark at these ports and sail to far-flung parts of the world to project British power and coercion. It was, as I said, an important part of the security, the commerce of the empire. It also shows the importance of the Irish soldier and Ireland in the British military. And this is whether it's in the army, the navy, militia forces, and of course the East India Company. And finally, it shows how military and civilian life was deeply embedded in Ireland, sometimes positive and sometimes less positive. So with that, I conclude and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Ciaran. And we'll move straight on to Stephen Press, who is going to tell us about a little known place. Okay, Stephen.
Okay, thank you, Glenda. Let me try to share my screen. Okay. Thank you to all for being here, and thank you to the organizers. I look forward to the discussion. Today, I would like to talk to you about neutral Mresnet, which you can see pictured here. It was a square-mile stretch of land sandwiched really right between Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. Lasted about 100 years, between 1815 and 1819. The thousands of people residing in neutral Mresnet lacked an organized government. They lived off the grid, so to speak, free from taxation and military service duties, but they also had no police, no legal currency, no proper law courts, and no governmental presence in a number of sectors that we would normally associate with state responsibility, or rather ones which we often came to associate with state responsibility in the post-Napoleonic era and over the course of the 19th century. These sectors that were really absent in neutral Mresnet included things like road maintenance, provision of drinking water, schooling, basic sanitation, workplace regulation, food safety, and disease control. For most of the century of neutral Mresnet's existence, practical control over its people and its resources lay in the hands of the local industry. This was a for-profit multinational mining company that, because it owned rights to the mine, also held a monopoly on the supply of high-quality zinc to the rest of the world. This zinc adorned rooftops in Baron Haussmann's Paris, and this zinc undergirded the weapons and telegraph wires essential to 19th century Europe's modernization and globalization. It was also this zinc that, so I submit, explained the vacuum of state power in neutral Morrisnet, which resembled, you could say, a mixture of the Wild West and Monaco. In 1814, 1815, zinc was a commodity coveted by Prussia and the Netherlands. These two powers hesitated to fight too hard over the lucrative zinc mine in neutral Morrisnet because they might lose access to it if the territory fell under another state's control. As this was going on, the strange, unresolved status of neutral Morrisnet profoundly affected the people who lived there and would continue to do so for about 100 years. At first, this was a small group of about 300, but eventually it rose to, estimates vary, but perhaps as many as 7,000. The archives I've been looking at actually broaden this story quite a bit, and here you can see another map of the neutral area. These archives reveal that neutral Morrisnet became a constant irritant in European affairs by intersecting with a number of larger questions: the admission of new states to the international system, the shape of national unification movements, the internationalization of culture wars over anti-clericalism, the codification of international law, the solidification of microstates, such as the Vatican, and last but not least, the secret hatching of the German military's Schlieffen Plan, which ran right through this area, the northernmost point, as World War I began. So perhaps more importantly, here we have another picture, neutral Morrisnet poses some overarching questions relating to state sovereignty in the 19th century. First, to what extent did sovereignty continue to function as a commodity for barter between states, despite an apparent decline of and transition away from the old regime in the wake of the French Revolution? Second, to what extent did modern European states, even aggressively expanding ones like Prussia, consistently see aspects of their governance as a value proposition? Finally, what kind of uncertainty does neutral Morrisnet reveal about the criteria we have, or don't have really, for defining and understanding statehood in post-Napoleonic Europe? To give you a sense of what I mean, let me briefly give some vignettes from the history of neutral Morrisnet, the history that I think attests in a small way to how the Congress of Vienna lived on well into the era of high imperialism and World War I. In 1814 and 1815, as you all know better than I, Europe's great powers gathered at Vienna to redraw the map of a world devastated by 2 decades of war. The Congress of Vienna's dancing has become legendary, obviously, as has its concern for security, balance of power, many other considerations. But as research by Glenda, Sluga, and others has shown, the Congress was also marked by a climate in which statistics were increasingly dominating, influencing and arguably dominating statecraft. And this was especially true when it came to diplomats arbitrarily disposing over the lives of millions of people through territorial transfers and assignments. At Vienna, officials made a regular practice of trading and selling territorial claims. They were convinced in many cases that the value of territory had an identifiable equivalence in human lives, generally called souls, as well as cash and other commodities like say, timber. This horse trading failed to work in the case of, quite a few places, really. And one of those was neutral Morrisnet, or rather Morrisnet as it was first called. This was a sleepy town that had been under the control of, really been part of the Austrian Netherlands for a very long time. It had been annexed by France during the Revolutionary Wars. And of course, its fate was somewhat open at the time of the Vienna Congress. By mistake, in 1814, 1815, Prussia was promised to both the new Kingdom of the Netherlands and at the last second to a disgruntled Prussia. Prussia, of course, was long considered a kingdom of disparate parts, tied together only by a military. And Prussia initially thought the Rhineland, including Morrisnet, quite a bit less valuable than Saxony. Of course, that was ultimately wrong. Nonetheless, at the time, Prussia, once tied to the Rhineland, was seeking to realize its social and economic potential, as well as to maximize the number and value of its souls. In this effort, zinc was seen by Prussia as indispensable. So when it came time to really settle this question of where Morrisnet would go, the Dutch sought to pay the Prussians off to bow out. And the Prussians also insisted that they were going to buy the Dutch out. And the lead negotiator here, from the Prussian perspective, and here we have an image of the mine in the early 1800s, the lead man responsible for Mresnet's mine being seen as indispensable was a statistician named Johann Gottfried Hofmann. Glenda has more knowledge about him than I do, but he had a nickname, the Soul Trader, and he decided to insist that Prussia could not lose this mine no matter what. So under his direction, Prussia began trying to work out compensation packages to make the Dutch go away and give up. Dutch didn't agree to do that. They worked out their own compensation packages, which Prussia wouldn't accept. And so provisionally, because after all, no one wanted to go to war over this in the context of the Vienna Congress, Prussia and the Dutch agreed to loosely consider this area neutral. That is to say, it would not be occupied militarily by either one of them. And they just agreed to work this out at an indefinite point in the future. However, I want to show how that became a problem. First thing was, the point I want to make is that this was actually something that could never be worked out satisfactorily in terms of statistics. The money involved, the people involved, the impact, all of it didn't really fit or didn't really add up in a way that was hoped for. By the 1820s, here's another example of that, one of the many, many, many attempts to divide this place up in a way that was mutually satisfactory over the 100-year or so span of neutral Mresnet. By the 1820s, Prussia was somewhat infamously crushing small states and legal enclaves in and around its territory. Most of these were unpopular vestiges of the Holy Roman Empire that, of course, Napoleon had dissolved, but a lot of them, were precisely what was rendering Prussia a kingdom of shreds and patches. So Prussia's creating this new customs union, a lot of which involves standardization of tariffs and tolls, but a lot of which also involves frequent violations of other smaller states' sovereignty in an effort to create really a unified and properly functioning customs zone. In that effort, Prussia determined that it could compensate smaller and medium-sized states for violations of their sovereignty through cash payments. The idea was that basically everything had its price. Sovereignty too had its price. Here you can see some continuities again intellectually. And this was simply the way Prussia would go about it. It would calculate a compensation package for the injury of sovereignty or the displacement of sovereignty when it came to other German states. In neutral Mresnet, there's an interesting twist on this. Prussia basically decides not even to try to enforce customs, let alone standardization. And this is in part, again, because of the perceived importance of zinc. The Dutch, for their part, agree too that any kind of interference in this place is too delicate because it risks losing them control of the zinc. And so therefore, better not to really try to enforce laws firmly when it comes to customs or really to get too precise about anything. The downside of that, if you will, is that this place becomes one of Europe's premier smuggling centers, as enclave and exclave territories often tended to do. And smuggling, of course, is a problem that doesn't remain confined to one place, no matter how small. So this becomes, neutral Mresnet, despite a somewhat orderly name, becomes a big center for criminality and smuggling for all of Europe, develops a reputation for lawlessness. Our archived correspondence again reveals how a lot of people and officials were concerned about this problem and urged higher ups in the Dutch and Prussian governments to do something about it, but they didn't. And they kept saying they couldn't because, again, according to their calculations, doing so was not as valuable or lucrative as the status quo, no matter how kooky that came to seem. And this did indeed seem pretty kooky to a lot of people because there was still no police in neutral Mresnet. People couldn't really get married there in a clear way. There was no budget for anything like roads. And again, this was something that in theory, Prussia and the Dutch would have liked to agree on, but only by really buying the other party out. And they just could not, no matter how hard they kept working, arrive at a formula for that. In the 1830s, we had political revolution erupt, well, in many parts of Europe, but particularly in Belgium, which of course detached itself from the Netherlands. And after a lot of confusion that's really uncovered in correspondence surrounding neutral Mresnet, or rather reinforced, Belgium formally inherited the Dutch claim to neutral Mresnet. Belgium, of course, is often regarded as the quintessential artificial state. And it's interesting, again, looking at neutral Mresnet to see another way in which its quest for recognition formal recognition of its independence was, kind of in fits and starts. Prussia at one point refused to recognize Belgium by virtue of this question of neutral Mresnet. Other European powers were involved. And one of the things it sheds light on, I think, is how in this post-Napoleonic era, although we'd like to think of, statehood as being relatively worked out, the European powers didn't really have a good set of criteria, really any set of coherent criteria for formally admitting new states. Obviously, we do get Greece, we get a couple other cases, but in most instances, beyond saying, I support this effort, or this is a justified independence movement, or this is a new state that's in keeping with royalist or legitimate principles, there's not a lot of precision here. And that's something I think that really comes out in the correspondence around neutral Mresnet. And this lack of standards, I think, is something that lingers into the late 19th century and winds up becoming operative when we look at things like would-be states in Eastern Europe, but also instances of microstates, which I'll talk about shortly. This uncertainty continues to dog Mresnet in a lot of ways. The mine grows very considerably. Its attractive wages, and to some extent, the lack of laws in this place proved very attractive for a number of people, not just workers, but again, all sorts of criminals, as well as Catholic pilgrims seeking refuge from persecution, or any number of other factors. Anarchists and other dissidents also kind of arrive in neutral Mresnet in surprisingly large numbers in ways that were not anticipated in the aftermath of the Vienna Congress. And the Belgian state, also another interesting point here, really is quite consistent with its Dutch predecessor in saying they don't wish to rock the boat too much in this place, because doing so, again, really threatens a vital economic interest when it comes to the Belgian nation. So this, calculated distance, if you were, this refusal to really step in and sort of formally sort this place out, that lasts pretty much all of the 19th century and into the 20th. There are, again, various experiments here in relation to neutral Mresnet that I think are interesting to consider in the light of concern for security. One of them is to turn this into a proper condominium, as it was often called in international law, the idea being that shares of sovereignty or functions of sovereignty could be divided between Belgium and Prussia, later unified Germany. This is an idea that quite notoriously fails in the case of Schleswig-Holstein when it comes to Austria and Prussia, but it's also tried in neutral Mresnet. And there too, I guess we can't really say it fails, but we can say it led to led to a series of rather strange legal contortions. Belgium and Prussia decided to create something like a legal system here by making the argument that the Code Napoleon, which had been introduced into this area while it was annexed to France, remained the law of the books, the law of the land, and that really, in order to adhere to the rule of law, various Prussian and Belgian courts, no matter how scattered, would try cases related to neutral Mresnet in accordance with the 1810 version of the Code Napoleon, which remained stuck in time and could not be adapted or modified in any way. Obviously, and particularly as has been noted by previous speakers today, this brought with it a host of complications, not least the question of trial by jury. So just kind of skipping ahead here a little bit, I want to note a few more ways in which this strange, seemingly singular place actually, again, touches on some broader issues in post-Napoleonic Europe. One of them is what will become of what we would now call microstates. They did not have a clear name at the time. Most of the names were pejorative, but there were tons of these in Europe. If we look at the long sweep of early modern and modern history, the number obviously goes down over time, but not all of them are in fact just fossils. A lot of them were, in a sense, really forged and solidified through agreements with larger European powers. And these agreements usually involve something like financial compensation or payoffs. That's certainly the case for Monaco, the most famous really of all these. But to some extent, I want to look at this question of micro-statehood, one which fascinated sort of literary figures of the day like Tolstoy, among others. I want to look at this as a way to get at what is artificial and what is natural in the view of 19th century European intellectuals and statespeople. This, of course, has to do a lot with which states are formally admitted into the international system and which ones are treated with sort of deference and which ones are treated with rather sort of high-handed and unfair methods. Bismarck, for example, would go on to refer, he was quite interested in neutral Mresnet, and he did see it on par in some ways with a place like Monaco. And he rather intriguingly referred to Monaco as a fake state and casino state, and was careful to avoid legitimizing it in international fora. Don't want to belabor this. I want to kind of wrap up. I'm happy to talk more if anyone is interested about what became of neutral Mresnet, but in a sense, it's a study into a lot of aspects of statehood. What does it take to make a state? How little can you govern while still being a state power, or still claiming sovereignty? What is the permissibility in sort of international law, but also in terms of domestic politics, of trading in sovereignty, of putting cash value on it, or really associating it with economic questions? How much of a state comes from the top down? How much of a state comes from bottom up? All these are old questions in a sense, but ones I think that can be revisited anew by reference to neutral Mresnet. And I think final point here is, the Congress of Vienna, which in a lot of ways, of course, is a transitional point, also displays a lot of continuities with the old regime, as has been discussed by other presenters. To my mind, one of these continuities, continuing to think of territory and sovereignty to some extent as property. There are a lot of analogs to private property in international law, of course, one of which is, say this idea of a condominium. But yeah, just kind of zeroing in on that by reference to this strange place, I think can be illustrative or maybe even suggestive for larger phenomena in terms of the development of European states in the long 19th century. So I will go ahead and wrap up there. Another view of this place. Here we have one of the many sort of legal attempts to make sense of complicated jurisdiction here. Yeah, we'll wrap it up there and look forward to questions and answers.
Great. Thanks very much, Stephen. So I think we've got about 20 minutes or so for questions. I've got quite a few here. So perhaps we'll start with the last paper first, because it's the last question I have in front of me. It's from Elise, and she asks, how does Stephen relate Mresnet to the German statelets that survived the 1815 settlement? Actually, I'll just give you two together and then we'll take a few for each one. And the other one is, could you explain what in the minds of those creating this neutral state was the role of private capital in maintaining security and prosperity in Mresnet? Was international capitalism considered a pacifying force? So you've got two questions there.
Okay, so first question, statelets, they're absolutely related. I can't claim to have worked that out, but one of the things that goes on in Prussian correspondence is they have a formula, again, related to numbers, for which states are real states and which states aren't. Precisely the people crafting policies for the customs union are crafting policies related to neutral Mresnet, and they're saying when you have a certain number of people in a place, this rises to the matter of serious or true state concerns. When it stays below that threshold, you can act differently. You can act with a kind of callousness or indifference to normal governmental issues. That threshold varies, and it's one of the things I'm trying to pin down. But yes, it's definitely related to the statelet issue. A lot of those states, Schaumburg-Lippe and the like, are treated as fake states by Prussia. Private capital, yes, absolutely important. A lot of this capital is coming from Paris. Many of the people involved in neutral Mresnet are very wealthy and very influential in the government, not just to places like Belgium and to some extent Prussia, but also France. So that is perceived often as a pacifying or overriding force.
Okay, thank you. And we have two questions going backwards, two questions for Ciaran. From Alexander, were fortresses in Ireland used for public health or quarantine purposes as well? And another from Beatrice, the Wellington Barrier was erected after 1815, and partly demolished in the 1830s. It was not just a military instrument. It was also meant to bind Netherlands, Belgium into the Congress system and signal defense preparation to France. Many fortresses were disbanded in the 1830s because France did not seem a direct threat anymore. Industrial revolution demanded broader roads into cities. Could you affirm this for the Irish fortresses? That is, that they had more a preventative defense, security, and political function than a direct military one. So 2 questions for you.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'll answer in reverse order as well. So yes, they do have more of a defensive purpose than a military purpose in the wake of Waterloo, and certainly they aren't built on the scale as they would be elsewhere in the Empire or in Britain. They are usually smaller barracks and smaller forts and defensive structures, but at the same time, I think it's particularly important to see the fortified nature of police barracks. And that continues all the way through with the Royal Irish Constabulary. And even now, even today in Ireland, we refer to police stations as police barracks often. And that's an echo of the militarized nature of the earlier forces. And to answer Alex's question, it was about, sorry, could you actually repeat?
About health and quarantine, where the fortresses used for health.
Yes. As far as I know, not so much. By this point, you would kind of, as the century progresses, you have workhouses being built in Ireland, and these often had fever hospitals within them. You sometimes have ships being used as prison hulks, but sometimes barracks were used on occasions for public health. Ireland was actually often used both in the 18th and into the 19th century as a sort of a depot for the British Army. So if you needed to just station a regiment and you didn't want too many regiments in Britain, you'd send them to Ireland and they would be stationed in Ireland for a while. This was until the Cardwell reforms. Okay,
thank you. And now to Giuseppe. I've got lots of questions. I want to ask you about one of your cartoons, but first the other people. So Vittoria Princi asks, I'm really fascinated by the intelligence networks clash across the Adriatic between British and Russians and the involvement of local actors, such as Neapolitan subjects in a geographically and culturally close region of South Italy to the Ionian and Balkan region. Could you tell us a bit more about this aspect of the security system? And then Elise asks, in my sources of Russian provenance, circa 1820, I've come across references to plans and projects for political reform supported by the King of the Two Sicilies. Were there such plans? Can you elaborate? Perhaps we'll do those 2 and then we have more. Okay.
Thank you. So many thanks for this question. I had to skip a bit the part on the intelligence network because there was already too much material to show. But the main point is that British agents in the two Sicilies occur, and is agents in Apulia, especially Richard Church, who was an Irish general who was in charge of the Napoleon Foreign Corps in Apulia, who were dispatched there to crush the revolutionary forces of Carbonari and other secret societies. They realized that Veneto, Ionian, and Ionian Greek subjects were moving across that Ionian space between the Ottoman borderland and the Neapolitan frontier to disseminate information and to circulate information between Greek patriots and Neapolitan patriots on the possibility of the arrival of Russian forces in the Mediterranean. At that time, there were already plans in action for the cession of some islands in the Mediterranean, some Spanish island to Russia, and the British agents were very worried about that too. So they they were just disseminating information across that space, and the Russian corps were mainly interested in creating some group of forces, of Greek forces, under their orders in Apulia, because Richard Church at that time was controlling several foreign corps in Apulia. So they were attempting to use that as a way to project Russian influence in that space to promote other imperial interests. And as regards the plan and projects for reforms, there were several attempts by Russian agents to influence the king of the two Sicilies. So since the Napoleonic warfare to the 1850s, there was even an attempt after the 1849 to establish through Russian networks the new Austrian constitution, the constitution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1849 in the two Sicilies. But they always failed, because since the late 1820s, the king of the two Sicilies just blocked any attempt to receive reforms from above or from other powers.
Okay, great. So now we're going to start at Giuseppe and work our way back down. So Giuseppe, if you don't mind, we've got some more questions. One is from Alexander, asking whether you think of your work methodologically as more within imperial or international history, or both. And then I wanted to ask whether you think your work makes us rethink or revise the general view of the Tsar Alexander supporting the Quadruple Alliance above all else until 1825. And can we look at the, maybe we can't, one of your cartoons, the one where you've got Louis XVIII in his wheelchair on one side. He seems to be obsessed with with something in front of him, but we'd have to have a look, because I thought that your civilizational argument might have a sexuality aspect to it. Anyway, starting with those questions.
Okay, so as regard Alexander's question, I would put it more in the imperial sphere. So I always looked at my research as something in between intellectual history and imperial history. Especially at that time, most of the actors in the dual Sicilian space perceive that region, they're totally aware of that they're living in an inter-imperial space. What their effort is to transform that inter-imperial space into an international space. So a space where empires are not just dictating the terms of the order, of the legal order in that region, but where empires and nation could coexist. And so that's why they came up, especially after the 1848, with a plan to reform international law and to establish international law upon the principle of nationality, because they believed that was the only way to create a truly international system. And by international, they meant a universal. They preferred to use the word universal or cosmopolitan system. So it depends on the periods, but I would rather say that it was more like part of an imperial framework, especially the first part of my research. And as regards the role of the Tsar and the alliance, William McClure and the other British diplomats believed that there was a deep rift between Austria and Russia at that time. So they believed they could cooperate with Austria, but not with Russia. They believed in cooperation with Austria in the two Sicilies, but perceived Russia as an imperial threat, mainly because they did not see Austria as a maritime imperial power. while they were aware that Russia could come back to the Mediterranean, which was their recurring fear after the Peace of Tilsit of 1807. And that was mainly connected with what I said about the intelligence network. So in the Ionian Sea, they were totally aware that there was something going on between the Ionian Islands and Naples, between Russian ambassadors in Naples and Greek patriots. And they feared that Russia and the Tsar could really take up supporting again nationalities in the Mediterranean, as Britain had done during the Napoleonic Wars. So they feared that Russia could really become the agent of a new liberal peace against Britain in the Mediterranean. I hope this can help.
I was thinking more about, actually, I mean, given we have a little bit of time, I was actually thinking more about the general view that the Tsar himself, like historiographically, there's an historical view that the Tsar was so committed to the Quadruple Alliance that he wouldn't allow the Greek question to be taken up as a Russian question, right? You're arguing that in fact there's a lot of support for the Greek insurgency, or and that so does that mean, does that go against our historical view of the Tsar as so committed to the Quadruple Alliance that he's trying to suppress Russian interests in terms of the Ottoman Empire?
I would say that there's a difference between the leaders, the main figures of these of the great powers, and the agents on the spot. And that happens with Britain too, because at that time the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office were already being consolidated and established, but still they had a few margins, and they have some space for maneuvering. And the same thing happened with Dacour and Maitland. For certain aspects, they were autonomous, so they could shape their own policy. But then, of course, they had to refer back to Castlereagh. And with Russian agents, the connection with the authority of the Tsar was even weaker. So right. I'm not claiming that the Tsar had those views, but definitely these agents on the spot, they were mainly former Venetian agents, so people that lived in the Venetian Imperial War that did not exist anymore. They nurtured these views. Right,
that makes sense. I'm looking at the other questions. I mean, I still think we could look at the cartoon at some point, but maybe we'll talk about that another time. Okay. And so I have, I have another question for each of you. Let's start with, for Stephen, what happened to neutral Mresnet? Is it part of Belgium? That's Paulo de Souza.
Yes. I mean, I left uncovered sort of the later stages of the history here, but the Treaty of Versailles does assign what it calls, I think, the former neutral Mresnet to Belgium. That is not without impact. This is done without a plebiscite, which is interesting. It is done, as the Treaty of Versailles states, quote, in compensation for the loss of various Belgian forests. And actually, it winds up becoming a sort of touchstone for the Nazis as well, who will wind up re-annexing neutral Mresnet at sort of the order of Hitler. But yeah, that's the story. So today it's something of a book.
I was just thinking, is it going to be a book like Jan Ruger on Heligoland? Are you going to do something with
that's my hope. I don't know whether anyone will read it, but that's my hope.
I think it's so fascinating. Never heard of the place. Now we all want to go and visit. Maybe. Maybe.
Well, it's not like going to blow you away.
No, probably not, but still interesting. Huh? And then Ciaran, this is from Baukje Hamsma. I was wondering whether the cultural role of the Shannon for Ireland changed after the Union and the British military control over Ireland was exerted via the infrastructure of the river.
The cultural role.
Yes.
Yes. I suppose it is an interesting thing, because the cultural role of the Shannon has always been one of the important rivers most important rivers in Ireland. I'm going to claim my local Boyne River is the most important out of loyalty to my locality. But it was seen as the dividing line between what could be considered civilized or English Ireland and the more Gaelic part of Ireland, the province of Connacht, and of course the infamous forced relocation of people beyond the Shannon, and to get using the infamous phrase to hell or to Connacht. So it had been seen as this dividing line between the English part of Ireland and then the more Gaelic part. This to a large extent it does fade away, but it doesn't disappear completely. And even nowadays there is still a marked difference. I remember a talk I went to which showed the ownership of tractors in 20th century Ireland, and it showed the luxury tractors, the modern tractors, and the map is very much a Eastern focused map, and then there's no tractors out in the West in the 1940s, 1950s. So it's still, to a certain extent, is a dividing line. But the built infrastructure along the Shannon does certainly show its importance, whether it's the batteries on the lower Shannon that I looked at, whether it's the castle at Limerick from the medieval period, or the castles and Napoleonic fortifications further upriver in Athlone as well. These are all important crossing points in Ireland.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question for Giuseppe again comes from Lord Kaspari, who asks, the bombardments on Algiers by the British and the Dutch navies in 1816 that led to, amongst other things, the release of 1,000 slaves and the abolishment of yearly payments to the day, did it have any impact on the two Sicilies?
Yes, of course. That was one of the reasons that the British diplomats used to negotiate a better commercial treaty with Naples in 1816, because they claimed that they had freed the two Sicilies from the threat of piracy. At the same time, they blocked, before that expedition, they blocked any attempt on the part of the two Sicilies to create a coalition with Spain and other powers to attack Algiers and stop the practice of piracy, because they did not wish to have any more foreign ships in that space. So they want to take the matter in their own hands and use that to, let's say, bully weaker powers and to exert more power upon them.
Okay, well, I think that's been a really great session. Thank you very much for your papers. And I'm really looking forward to what you all do with this work, which is in different stages for each of you. And I think, Alexander, so we're going to reconvene at 9:30 Central Eastern European time. Is that right?
I think, considering how late it is, how about we just reconvene in about 10 minutes? This way we'll save everyone enough time to rest. I just need to talk to our keynote speaker, make arrangements that she's ready to go, and I will close this session, but everyone please just jump back in and we'll continue from there. Thank you.
10 minutes and we get to hear from Elise Wirtschafter.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks
very
everyone
much.
in session.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.